Hello everyone, and I would like to start this video by saying that I am doing a part 2, that this is a 2-part series, um, and but also I will be biased because I am generally a right-wing person, so like a center, I like to consider myself like a center-right person, so I'm like, um, I may be a little biased though, but I tried to look at it as objectively as I could. But, anyways, but yeah, as you can see by the title of the video, this will be the history of the Democratic Party. By the way, these will be little summaries. These are not going to be in depth. I'm going to try to fit this all in like 20 minutes. Hopefully I can do that. But, yeah, it's gonna be concise. I'm not gonna try and go in depth, but knowing me, I could talk for like 20 minutes about one thing. Anyways, so to start this off, the Democratic Party was first established in 1837, because I believe Andrew Jackson was the first Democrat president. I know that. And it was in 1836 when he was elected as the first Democrat, political party Democrat. Like, because before that there were the Democratic Republicans, and that was basically it. Yeah. Because the Federalists had already stopped their stuff, so it was the Democratic Republican John Quincy Adams versus the Democratic Republican of Andrew Jackson in 1824. And when Jackson lost, he called it a corrupt bargain. And ran for re-election on the campaign of, he basically tried to re-envision and quote-unquote modernize or bring Jefferson ideas into the 1830s and into the new century, in the 19th century, but he very much talked to and tried to empathize, I believe, tried to talk to and understand the quote-unquote common man and the common yeoman farmer in the South, but also he got a lot of votes in the North. But that's also because there were like 3 or 4, I think there was like 4, was there 4 people running? I think there was like 4 people running in 1832. In 1828, I know there was. In 1824, I know there were like 4 people running. But I think there were a couple of people running in 1832. But anyways, Jackson won. This is his second term winning. And he won a landslide, basically, because he was popular, because he came in and he also wrote on the back of wanting to have universal suffrage for males, and that's why I titled it Southern Suffrage, because he was a Southerner. Democrats were very much the party of the South. He was from Virginia. Like, it is what it is. Now, in 1836, when his successor was elected, his successor, I believe, was from New York. So in the later 1830s, they weren't so much Southern, but even then, they had Southern sympathizers like Martin Van Buren, which was Andrew Jackson's successor, was a Southern sympathizer. So, and very much took the Southern side on a lot of things. But as you will see, that will be their strategy until the Civil War. After Andrew Jackson, is just nominate a bunch of Northern Democrats, so you can get the Southern vote because they're Democrats, and you can get like New York State to make them win the election. But anyways, yeah, that's 1830s as a wrap. Southern suffrage. Again, the big things were slavery expansion in the West, but also Indian affairs. They were the biggest thing in the 1830s, up until the Panic of 1837. Then it was banking. But, yeah, there were big things for the Democrats in the first decade of their existence. and the 1840s, they were very much the war hawks. Like, I dislike that the Republicans were the war hawks in the 2000s, like very much the war hawks in the 2000s, but after doing research, the Democrats themselves are also war hawks, but like 160 years before then, before 2001. But yeah, so a little bit of context. In 1840, the Whig Party, which was very much the Northern Party of, industrialists, because by then the Industrial Revolution had started taking place. There's a bunch of factories and a bunch of people in the North, and to the Northern people, a lot of them were factory workers or labor unions. Well, no, because that wasn't a thing yet. But they were factory workers, they were tradesmen, they probably worked in banks if they were in New York, like, and just stuff like that. It was a different type of person, a different type of way of living in the North. And the South was very into the expansion of slavery. That's why they were the war hawks. That's why the Democrats were the war hawks, because the Democrats, actually no, I think James K. Polk was from Tennessee. Scrap that. I think it was from Tennessee. So he wasn't actually, but I know Franklin Pierce. So basically the 1852, 1856, both of them were Northern Democrats. And after the Civil War, they only nominated Northern Democrats, I believe, and won. Anyways, so 1840s, they were war hawks, because in the 1844 election, when James K. Polk won, he ran on annexation of Texas and other stuff, but the Democratic Party was very much, and every time the Democratic Party would, try and pass legislation or try and basically pass legislation to say, we're going to invade this country, the Whigs would always be there to try and compromise them. But yeah, they ended up getting what they wanted. They got Texas, they got New Mexico, Arizona, California. They did the Mexican-American War. Even though a Whig, Zachary Taylor, was like a Whig president, Zachary Taylor was a general at the time, and he was the big fighter of the war. And then his legacy was disgraced by the Democrats. But that's my bias coming in. I gotta stop that. 1850s. I like to think of them, 1850s Democrats, as just complacent establishment, because that's what they were after Franklin Pierce, which was just, after Franklin Pierce, it was just James Buchanan, but that's what they were at the time, because in 1856, when, like, the election of 1856 was, I imagine, just about the preservation of the Union, and James Buchanan and all of his administration just ignored slavery as much as they could, just to be like, because he truly believed that abolitionists would cause a civil war, and that it would cause a breakup of the Union, and it did and it didn't. It's a way of looking at it. I wouldn't agree with that, but it's a way of looking at it. But yeah, it just, also the first election in which the Republican Party was a part of, which again, that will be another video that will be up, because this is going up on a Thursday, so the Republican video will be up on that next Tuesday, so come around for that video. Yeah. But yeah, 1850s, they were the complacent establishment, because even Franklin Pierce, during his administration, even though he tried to focus on, I believe, foreign affairs to get everyone's attention, try to get everyone's attention off of slavery, he still didn't want to answer the slavery question. And also, by this time, the Democrats were very into the idea of quote-unquote popular sovereignty, where a state would vote on Northern Democrats were into popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats didn't even want states to have to vote on it. It's slave states everywhere, like literally. Anyways, 1860s Democrats, they were the Union Democrats. They were which union in this sense is not labor. It has nothing to do with labor. It's just preservation of the, sorry about that. Preservation of the Union. And I imagine they were very critical of Abraham Lincoln's wartime measures, which I partially am myself, partially not, but I need to go back to this. Oh, but yeah, obviously it didn't work. Whatever the messaging was, it didn't work. And I believe Democrats Democrats in their entire existence from the 1830s to now have been for lower tariffs every single time, every single election. That is something that they've actually kept consistent, which is weird for a political party to keep something consistent throughout their entire time. But yeah, they've been into lower tariffs since the beginning. But anyways, now, but the 1860s Democrats, they weren't really cared for, obviously, because they seceded anyways. At least their southern counterparts seceded, and then they got blamed for that. Whether you think it was, obvious or not, but they got blamed for it. But weirdly, the American people would elect them into Congress majority in the Senate, in the House, like just a decade after the Civil War. We really don't learn all this. Anyways, 1870s. So, brief context. 1868 was when the Grant administration, and when Ulysses S. Grant, the famous general from Ohio, go Ohio. But the Ulysses S. Grant from Ohio was elected president of the United States, and in 1872 he was reelected. But in 1869, after he was first inaugurated, between 1869 and 1872, he was found to have been either he was corrupt or just the people around him were corrupt. So in 1872, the Democrats formed a coalition, or tried to, and they didn't even put up a nominee. They put up a nominee, quote unquote, with a liberal Republican party. So at least that's what they called themselves. And their entire thing was just anti-Grant, and obviously Grant wiped them out in the 1872 election. But the 1876 elections where this decade and this brand of Democrat really shined, because they got Samuel J. Tilden against Rutherford B. Hayes. And this election is one of the 5 times in American history where the popular vote wasn't the winner of the popular vote wasn't the winner of the Electoral College. And that is this thing in 1876, where Tilden not only lost the popular vote, but he lost the Electoral College by one vote. That's okay. But yeah, they were anti-corruption Southerners, and I say Southerners because they still were the party of Southerners. They still very much believed in that Southern cause. But they added to their Southern cause and their reduction in tariffs and their whole wrapping up of states' rights. They added anti-corruption, like anti-Republican corruption, because I believe they tried to tie Hayes to Grant, and as you can see, it worked, for the most part, well. Okay, moving on to the 1880s Democrats. They were very much bourbon Democrats. Also, to remind you, this guy, I believe, is from New York, and this guy is from New York. I know that. So I'm like, you can see a pattern after the Civil War. They start consistently nominating Northern Democrats, because they're like, we got the South. All we need is just a couple or a few Northern states. And they seem to target New York, because New York at this point had like over 30 and had a lot of electoral votes. It probably swung the election in a lot of cases. But like New York, I believe, used to be a swing state. Anyways, 1880s, they were the bourbon Democrats. I noticed this is the time when they start to become more establishment wrapped up in Wall Street. Like they go from trying to be states' rights, anti-corruption, opposition party to, okay, we're not really opposition, we are bought by Wall Street, basically. And I imagine that's partly how Cleveland got elected in the first place. But that's neither here nor there. But this was quickly reversed when in the 1890s, the Democrats ran as quote unquote common man populist, like the common man populist, where William Jennings Bryan, he was definitely populist. He was he brought a lot of new ideas to the American political system. Let's just say that. And he won all the South. He won a lot of the Midwest, which, as you can see by previous elections, the Republicans held the Midwest. So 1896 was a big year for the Democrats in the Midwest. But they didn't. But it's weird. They got all the southern states. They got like all but 3 of the Midwestern states. Because I count the Midwest as like west of this line, really. That's really like, even if you count it like this, okay, then they got all but 5 states. But point is, William Jennings Bryan, he ran very much on, I think it was getting rid of the gold standard or getting on the gold standard. Because I remember 1896 was very big on the gold and silver standard and was it mercantilism? I know, but I do know that it was very big on the gold and silver thing, and him wanting farmers to get stuff, and just really took a shift in the Democratic Party that was in the 1880s. It was very much northern, Wall Street bankers, urban Democrats, to going back to where it was just 2 decades ago with the Southerners and not even the Southerners now, the Midwestern farmers. Like, anyways, but all of the northern and like an industrial belt, what is now considered the Rust Belt, all of that voted for the Republican, which is, I'm like, interesting. Their farmer ideals and campaign apparently didn't resonate with the Rust Belt. But anyways, in the 1900s, this was a little confusing to me. Like, I didn't know how to classify 1900s Democrats, because they kept their populist message kind of, but it was also a precursor to Wilsonianism, but also it had to do, and also it talked about small government, like Southern small government principles. So it was like all of that wrapped up into one, which is probably how they never won an election in the first decade of the 20th century, because they had just so many different conflicting, like, confusing policies. Because on one hand they wanted small government, but on another they wanted big enough government to where the government could help the poor, and they wanted big government enough to where they could shut down the monopolies. And so I'm like, and on one point I believe they were anti-imperialist. But then on another, one of the Suez Canal. So I'm like, this is not the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. So I'm like, they had very conflicting policies. So small government progressives, question mark? Like, I really didn't know how to define them. The 1910s Democrats, they were very much just, they brought back their populism message, but also mixed it with progressiveness. So Progressive Democrats Part 2 is, wait, was there a previous? No, so this would be Part 1. Oh no, this is Small Government Progressives, Part 1, Part 2. But they're not even small government anymore. Like, Wilson wasn't small government. He was just progressive. So he was a populist, partially populist, but mainly progressive Democrats. And I think 1912 in the 1910s was really when the Democratic Party took its first step into becoming the progressive party of today. Their policies were not the same as today, but they laid the foundation for the modern Democratic Party. Anyways, and then, 1910s, they focused on, I believe they were anti-imperialist. They were obviously lower tariffs, as they've been. Woodrow Wilson did stuff with the labor unions, I believe. Labor unions, he nationalized some things, he criminalized speech in some things. I've talked about that in another video, about like the misunderstood presidency of Woodrow Wilson, or just the not told part of his presidency. But yeah, the 1910s Democrats populist, progressive Democrats, all of it. 1920s Democrats, they were Wilsonians, but they added being anti-corruption because in 1920, at the very beginning of the decade, a guy named Harding, something G. Harding, was it William G. Harding? I don't know, but G. Harding was elected president in 1920, and it was and the Teapot Dome scandal was very quickly a thing in his administration, and so he and the Republican Party temporarily took a huge hit from that. But by 1924, he had died. I think it was his vice president or his secretary of something, Calvin Coolidge, I imagine, distanced himself from that scandal and focused on how good the economy was because of Republican principles. I imagine is what he campaigned on. And the Democrats very much focused on, again, Wilsonianism, but also, again, adding anti-corruption to that because of the Teapot Dome scandal. And so 1930s Democrats, y'all know from history class, FDR, Democrats. That's all I had to put. That's all you need to know. They were into social welfare. He created Social Security. He nationalized some things. He completely overhauled our banking system. He got us into not in 1930s, but he got, like I said, he got Social Security. He did labor things. He completely transformed America. And when I said that the 1910s was the start of the Democratic Party, like the foundations, he ran with that. Oh my God, he ran with it. Anyways, so yeah, 1930s FDR Democrats. They weren't even trying to be small government anymore in the 1930s. They were just FDR progressive Democrats. Period. Like, even they quote unquote tried sometimes, as in okay, there were a couple anti-lynching bills, right, that came to his desk, and he still needed the Southern support for a lot of his progressive agenda. So some of his progressive agenda, I believe, would be supported by Northern Republicans, and then others would be supported by Southern Democrats. So the ones that he needed support from Southern Democrats on, he would agree that he wouldn't outlaw lynching and take civil rights stuff. But that's just a dark side of his presidency, just like a dark side of every presidency. But now am I trying to lighten up on not being okay with anti-lynching, and him vetoing that? No, I think that's terrible. But anyways, 1940 Democrats, they were still FDR because FDR, was a 4-time elected president and served 12 of the. Anyways, and after him, Truman was basically just a FDR 4th term. It is in 5th term because he won in a term on his own. So yeah, he was a successor to FDR, but he brought in the Cold War, and he started and he did the I don't know what it's called, but the thing in 1948 when he flew into Berlin and the Berlin airlift thing, that was nice. But I think he also started the Korean War, so that was something. And basically it was a mix of the progressivism with the quote-unquote anti-communism that they fronted in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s until the end of the Cold War in the 90s. But yeah, FDR / Cold War Democrats is basically what they were. They were still the same old Democrats that have been running the country for 20 years at that point. So anyways, 1950s Democrats, this man right here, Adlai Stevenson, they very much took even further of a sharp left turn because they had been we've been running the country for 2 decades. People keep electing us. And so then in 1952, they nominated a guy who was I put him as a social humanitarian / peace Democrat because he wanted the Cold War to stop, basically, and he wanted a lot of the wars that were going on and conflicts to end, and he wanted to put a lot of money into, you know, social things. And I think he was even trying to spout universal basic income. I don't know how true that is, but I believe he tried spouting. He spouted very progressive ideas for the 1950s. Um, like I said, he was Peace Democrat. It was a whole thing. He lost twice to the very popular Eisenhower, who I'll get to him when I do the history of the Republican Party. But anyways, 1960s Democrats, they took somewhat of a shift to the right, but it was only on their peace talks, like on their peace platform and their foreign policy platform. They took a shift to the right, because I believe Kennedy was actually anti-communist. But yeah, I believe Kennedy was actually anti-communist, and then LBJ, I believe, was also anti-communist, but more staunchly than JFK. Like, he actually did stuff about it, you know. And he ramped up Vietnam War people, like people going into Vietnam, soldiers fighting in Vietnam, which Adelaide never would have done ever. If anything, would have tried to get us out of the Korean War and out of the Vietnam War and stuff like that. But anyways, basically, the 1960 Democrats focused on civil rights. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965. LBJ declared the war on poverty in the 1960s. They were very much the party of social justice and helping the poor in whatever means they see fit. And they really, in some ways, they turned their backs on a good chunk of their coalition, which is probably when the South, the 1960s was probably the last decade where the South really stood with the Democratic Party, because they stood, I'm going to get to that later. But anyways, 1960s as a whole was just very much social justice, civil rights, welfare, and helping the poor, all of that in the Democratic Party. 1970s, moderation. They shifted hard to the right, as in from being like leftists to like center left with Jimmy Carter, when they had because he was a southern, like, Georgia farmer. Like, it just, and while he was from Texas, he was more left than Jimmy Carter was. Like, LBJ was more left than Jimmy Carter was, period, on certain things. On others, probably Jimmy Carter was probably more left on certain things, and LBJ was probably more left on other things. But anyways, 1970s, moderation and the fall of the FDR coalition. Again, this coalition went from the 1930s to the 1970s. Like, it was, some people argue from the 1930s to the 1990s, something like that. The Democratic Party really built a coalition that lasted half a century. Like, it just, okay. Anyways, and by the way, presidential elections and presidents don't tell you everything about what was going on. Because just because Nixon won and just because Eisenhower won in when they did, and just because Reagan won, didn't mean that it was trifectas for all 8 years or even 4 years. Like, Reagan never had a Republican House. Eisenhower had a trifecta for 2 years. And so the Democrats were always in power for this time. And anyways, that's why I say it was such a powerful coalition. Anyways, 1970s with the moderation and the fall of the FDR coalition. Now, Jimmy Carter really would be the last one to get all of the South. From North Carolina to Arkansas to Florida to Texas. He got all of it. And that would be the last time it would ever happen, because the Democratic Party fundamentally did not agree with the Southern principles and what the South believes in. But yeah, Jimmy Carter really tried to obviously criticized the Nixon administration and the Ford administration for very quickly pardoning his predecessor. And Ford was president during a really bad economic time. Same thing with Jimmy Carter. He did not fix it, so that's the same thing that bit him like 4 years later. Also, we can see New York starting to it was blue 100 years before this, but New York is really starting to trend in the left's direction. But yeah, also interesting fact: Minnesota will never go red. Like from 1976 to 2020, it didn't go red. So that's interesting. Anyways, next 1980s, they took a hard shift to the left with Walter Mondale in 1984, and with their person in 1980. Well, I know in 1984 they took a hard shift to the right, and in 1988 with Michael Dukakis, he was also a staunch leftist. I don't know if I would consider him a progressive, but definitely a staunch leftist. And that just didn't work in the 1980s wave of conservatism with Ronald Reagan and his stuff. But yeah, it was just they were into all of the very left-wing ideas. For American politics, very left-wing ideas. Also the beginning of the modern Democratic Party, because the Democrats really haven't changed. The 2020 Democrats and the 1980 Democrats, obviously they've changed on certain issues, but they're still both liberal Democrats, progressive Democrats, which liberal and progressive don't mean the same one. Anyways, 1990s, they were shifted back to the moderate side, and which won the Clinton coalition. Again, Clinton is the last, I believe, Clinton is the last Democrat to get any southern states. So that's something. He got, and this is also to realize, I think, because in the 1970s, the Rust Belt, so I'm like, hey, the 1990s is probably when the Rust Belt really started voting Democrat. But, except for Ohio and Indiana. But anyway, so the 1990s, they shifted to the moderate. They stopped being far lefties, basically, in American political terms. He was anti-death penalty. No, he was pro-death penalty. He wanted safe, legal, and rare abortions, unlike his predecessors. He wanted gun control laws, but he didn't want to ban bump stocks and get rid of assault weapons, stuff like that. He wanted, common sense. He probably wanted background checks. He didn't, and to try and get felons to not have guns. Stuff like that. He was also, I believe in 1992 or 1996, he ran on being anti-free trade and pro-protectionism, which a Democrat had never, I don't believe, had ever done before, because it's just not the Democrat way of doing things. But then very quickly, he signed free trade deals with Canada. So, anyways, point is, he really tried to moderate and come to the American people as a moderate, so he could get reelected in 1996 after the 1994 wave. But, anyways, the 2000s. Again, this was the second out of 2 times, but it was very difficult for me to characterize a Kerry voter. I don't know how to characterize a 2000s Democrat, excluding Obama in the very late 2000s, the early 2000s. I don't know, because some of them were anti the wars, some of them were pro the wars. I know environmentalism became a bigger thing in the Democratic Party. Same-sex marriage wasn't a thing in their party. Legalization of marijuana wasn't a thing in their party yet. Community college, free community college wasn't a thing in their stuff yet. It was very 2000 specific. Yeah. So I don't even like. I just put a generic bland establishment because that's what Kerry was, and I don't know. I don't know, and that's kind of what Gore was too. So I'm like, anyways. But then Obama came in 2008 and 2012 and said we're gonna be progressives, and that's what the Democrats have been ever since. Ever since 2008, the Democrats have been progressives. In 2008, Obama came in swinging hard. He was anti. He was anti the wars, the foreign wars. He was, at least that's what he campaigned on. By the way, he continued all of them, and created some. But that's what he campaigned on. He campaigned on closing up Guantanamo Bay. He campaigned on affordable health care. He campaigned on so many things that America felt like it needed in 2008 and 2012, apparently. But also because Romney was just not a good candidate. And in 2016, Hillary Clinton expanded on that, got even more progressive. And so the 2010s Democrats, they were progressives, very much. And the 2010s have just ended like 2 years ago. So like, it's very fresh. And that's why in 2020, and this is how it works, is that at the very beginning of the next decade, the party still holds its previous decade's like mindset. So 2020, Joe Biden and the media painted him as a moderate, but he just wasn't. His party platform was very much progressive. So the Democrats are still progressives. But anyways, I remember saying at the beginning of the video that I wanted to keep it under 20 at 20 minutes, and it's 37 minutes at the recordings. So love that for me. But yeah, now the next Tuesday's video is going to be about the history of the Republican Party, which, as someone who is center right and would vote for Republicans more than Democrats, that's going to be interesting because I don't. Oh, and by the way, I am biased, yes, obviously, when it comes to this and when it comes to the Republican Party, but I don't like the Republican Party, just like how I don't like the Democratic Party. Like, I know that, that's not very out of the ordinary. I imagine a lot of voters don't like the political parties, but a lot of them in reality just in 2020 voted because they didn't want the opposition candidate. But anyways, that was also very big in 2016. I imagine the last time a lot of people voted because they wanted their candidate to win was in 2012 with Obama. But anyways, or 2008 with Obama. But anyways, that was my video on the history of the Democratic Party from the 1830s to the 2010s. Very simplified, I tried to keep it very summaried. Yeah. I tried to keep, the subtitle or the description for each decade to the number 2 to 4 or 5 words. Like, I wanted to keep it very short and then describe very simply like what it is. Oh, but also at the very end, the 2010s Democrats, their issues mainly have been free community college, gun control laws, marijuana legalization, same-sex marriage. They've also focused, I realize, now that I'm saying it, they focus very much on social issues in 2010s. But anyways, I tell you, yeah. So that's gonna be this video. Stick around for part 2 coming next Tuesday, and I'll see you then. Goodbye.